Hello everyone and welcome back to Panik Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving only the dull glow of the moon to light my way. I wasn't sure why I decided to take the back roads. Maybe it was the quiet allure of the empty, rural path, or maybe I'd convinced myself I wanted to avoid the traffic that choked the main highways. Either way, I was alone now, with nothing but the hum of my engine and the occasional flicker of an old street lamp. The air outside was thick with a cold mist that clung to the ground, swallowing everything in its path. I turned the heater up, but it seemed to make no difference. The chill was inside me, creeping into my bones, slowly making me feel like I wasn't alone in the car. I glanced at the empty passenger seat, wishing someone was with me, but there was only the faint sound of the tires rolling over the uneven pavement. As the road stretched out before me, my mind wandered. The soft, rhythmic beat of the tires against the pavement had a way of calming me, almost lulling me to sleep. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation, but I told myself it was a peaceful change. The world seemed endless out here, silent, untouched. Then, I saw him. A figure. Tall, unmoving. He was standing in the middle of the field, no trees, no structures nearby, just endless grass stretching to the horizon. The man didn't move, his back to me, but something about the way his body was positioned made it feel like he was waiting. A figure in the mist. A dark silhouette, completely out of place in this desolate scene. I shuddered, but I couldn't tear my eyes away as I drove past. The headlights illuminated his shape for just a moment, but it was enough. His clothes were dark, blending with the shadows, but his presence seemed to distort the air around him, as though the world itself didn't want him there. For a split second, I felt like he was staring right at me. A chill ran up my spine, but I forced myself to look away, focusing on the road ahead. It was just some random person, right? Maybe he was out for a walk in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't my business. But as I turned my gaze forward, something inside me told me that wasn't the case. Something in the way his body had been perfectly still, his gaze fixed on me like he knew I was coming. I could almost feel his eyes on me now, even though I'd passed him. I tried to shake off the strange feeling creeping over me. I'm just being paranoid, I thought. The road was empty, the world around me too quiet. But then I saw it, something in the rearview mirror that froze me. The man had moved. How had he crossed the distance so quickly? I glanced at the mirror again, my heart beginning to race, and there he was. Standing at the edge of the field, still distant, but now he was closer than before. I gripped the wheel harder, the tires of my car humming faster as I pressed the accelerator. I didn't want to think about it. Didn't want to acknowledge the fact that I was suddenly terrified. The rearview mirror reflected nothing but fog, but the silhouette of the man was unmistakable, slowly following the curve of the road behind me. What the hell was happening? I sped up, my hands tightening around the wheel. The car roared, tires screeching as I pushed the gas pedal harder. My breath was shallow, panic creeping up my throat as I glanced behind me again. He was moving. No longer just standing still. He was walking, with the same eerie, deliberate pace. He wasn't running after me. He didn't need to. The fog seemed to carry him forward, almost as if it was moving with him, cloaking him in a veil of mist. I sped faster, feeling my heartbeat echo in my ears. I couldn't stop looking back. He was gaining on me. His figure was now clearer in the mirror, but the detail was all wrong. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes, boring into me. The air seemed colder, heavier. His presence filled the empty spaces around me, and I felt suffocated. I had to get away from him. I was going too fast now, the road blurring under me, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the figure that was still there, moving slowly, steadily, like he was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I couldn't escape him. No matter how fast I drove, no matter how sharp the curves, he was always just behind me. I could feel him. A gust of wind rattled the car, and I almost swerved off the road. I corrected myself, cursing under my breath, trying to focus. The headlights flickered for a second, just long enough for me to see his figure again, now much closer. It was as though he had been standing behind me all along, just out of view. Suddenly, the sound of a sign broke through the panic. A gas station, its lights flickering faintly in the distance, was the first sign of life for miles. I turned the wheel sharply, my tires screeching as I swerved onto the gravel lot, the car bouncing a little as I came to a stop. I was shaking, my hands slick with sweat as I quickly locked the doors, heart still racing in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The fog hung heavy over the station, the lights casting long shadows across the ground. I stayed in the car, watching the mist swirl outside. I couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror again. There, standing at the edge of the road, was the figure. He was just standing there, staring at me. I couldn't see his face, but I felt his eyes on me, watching. Waiting. I locked the doors again, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't stop him. But the longer I stared into that mirror, the more I realized, he wasn't moving. He wasn't coming closer. He was simply watching, his figure blending into the mist, fading away like smoke. Just when I thought the worst was over, the fog seemed to thicken around him, swallowing him whole. He was gone. Vanished. Like he'd never been there. I sat there, unable to move, frozen in place. The sound of my own breath was the only thing I could hear. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, unable to leave, unable to do anything but watch the spot where he had been. The feeling of his eyes still lingered, cold and distant, pressing down on me from some place I couldn't escape. When I finally dared to look again, the road was empty. The figure was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there. Waiting. Watching. And somehow, I knew he'd find me again. I stayed at the gas station for what felt like forever. The mist thickened around me, pressing in from every side. The lights above flickered every few seconds, casting long, shaky shadows over the parking lot. I couldn't bring myself to leave the safety of the car, even though I knew deep down that it wouldn't make a difference. The gas station was deserted, the dull hum of the old lights the only sound in the air. I kept checking the rearview mirror, my eyes darting over my shoulder, expecting to see that same figure standing in the shadows again. But the road was empty. The field was empty. Everything was still. Finally, after what felt like hours, I forced myself to start the car. The engine rumbled to life, and I slowly pulled out of the lot, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles ached. I tried not to look in the mirror as I drove away, but I couldn't help myself. Every mile felt like an eternity. The road seemed to stretch on, winding through the fog as I drove faster, faster, trying to outrun the feeling of being hunted. The silence in the car was deafening. But I knew, deep in my gut, that I hadn't escaped him. The man in the field, whoever he was still out there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. His cold eyes never left me. As I drove through the fog, every creak of the car, every whisper of wind against the windows, made my heart race. I glanced at the rearview mirror one more time, and this time, I didn't see him. But I felt him. And I knew, with an icy certainty, that this wasn't over. He would follow me. Always. And someday, when I least expected it, he would be waiting for me again. I didn't plan on staying at this dilapidated motel. My journey had taken longer than expected, and the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, turning the road slick and treacherous. I had hoped to make it to the next town, but the storm had other plans. My car, already on its last legs, sputtered and lurched to a stop, the engine finally giving up in a cloud of steam and frustration. A sign appeared through the fog, its red neon flickering weakly, *vacancy star. I had no choice. It was this or risk getting stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled into the gravel lot of the rundown motel, the crunch of the tires echoing through the silence like the first steps of a forgotten dream. The place looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. Its faded paint peeled away, and the windows were boarded up in places, leaving just enough room for a curious eye to peer through. The roof sagged in places, as if the motel itself had given up hope. I hesitated at the door, the gusts of wind and rain pushing against me, but the alternative was worse. A roof, even one so decrepit, was better than braving the storm outside. I pushed open the door with a creak, and stepped into the dim lobby. Behind the counter stood a man, his face obscured by shadow. His clothes were old, as if they'd been bought decades ago and never replaced. A beige, moth-eaten sweater clung loosely to his thin frame. His eyes were too wide, too still, and they didn't blink when I approached. His stare was unerringly intense, as if he could see straight through me. "Room for one?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. The man smiled, his lips curling in an expression that was more unsettling than friendly. "Only one room left, dear," he replied, his voice low and soft, almost a whisper. "Room 4. It's unusual, but it'll do for the night." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I needed shelter, so I nodded and accepted the key he handed me. His fingers brushed against mine, cold, far colder than they should have been. Room 4 was at the far end of the hall, its door creaking as I opened it. The room was small, worn down, faded wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. There was a single, unmade bed with a cheap, stained comforter, and a small wooden dresser. But what stood out the most was the large, cracked mirror hanging on the wall across from the bed. Its surface was spiderwebbed with fractures, distorting the faint reflection of the room. I set down my bag and stared at the mirror for a moment, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. The cracks in the glass twisted the reflection of the room in odd angles, making it seem as though something was off. But it wasn't until I turned away from the mirror that the unease truly settled in. Something wasn't right. I shook off the feeling and went to take a shower, hoping to wash away the dread crawling up my spine. The water was tepid, the shower head screeching as it dripped, but I didn't care. I was tired and wanted nothing more than to sleep. When I stepped out, I glanced at the mirror once again, wiping away the steam with a towel. The reflection wasn't quite right. The room in the mirror was different. The bed, in particular, stood out. It wasn't empty anymore. There was a figure sitting on it, its form obscured in shadow. I felt a chill grip my chest. The figure didn't move. It simply sat there, facing me, its posture unnervingly still. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the fear gnawing at the edge of my mind. I turned around quickly to check the room behind me. Empty. The room was exactly as it had been. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a shaky breath. I turned back to the mirror, wiping away more of the fog, but the figure was still there. This time, it leaned forward. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and I could feel its eyes on me, cold and empty, as if it were waiting for something. My skin prickled, and I quickly backed away from the mirror, my breathing shallow. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, probably the stress of the storm, the strange motel, and the bizarre man at the front desk. But when I turned to grab my phone, just to have something to distract myself, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. It wasn't me anymore. My reflection, or what I thought was my reflection, was staring at me with empty, hollow eyes. Its lips curled into a slow, twisted smile, one that didn't match my own expression. My reflection was mocking me, as if it knew something I didn't. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I tried to escape the room. The phone fell from my hand, but I didn't care. My pulse raced, and my body trembled, but I had to get away. I turned toward the door, only to hear the faintest sound, a soft scraping, like nails dragging across glass. I looked back to the mirror. The figure was gone. The room was normal again, or at least it seemed that way. I took a shaky breath, my mind reeling. I should leave. I should get out of here, but my legs felt like lead, too heavy to move. The door to the room suddenly creaked open, and I spun around, expecting to see the man from the front desk. But it wasn't him. It was the man from the mirror. The figure stepped through the door, his face now fully visible, pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His grin was wide and twisted, showing teeth that were yellow and sharp. He was no longer just a reflection. He was real. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My legs refused to move. The man, or whatever he was, advanced slowly, his footsteps echoing through the room like the ticking of a clock. "Leave," a voice whispered in the darkness. I spun toward the door, only to find the man from the front desk standing there, his expression stricken with fear. "You don't understand. It's too late." I tried to speak, to ask what he meant, but my throat was dry, my words lost in the air. The figure in the mirror was no longer smiling, it was now mouthing something, its lips forming silent words. The reflection was moving faster than I was, its hand pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. The man from the front desk grabbed my arm, his touch ice cold. "It's too late," he repeated, his voice trembling. "You shouldn't have stayed." But it was already too late. The man in the mirror wasn't smiling anymore. He was staring at me with hollow, empty eyes, his hand now reaching toward me through the glass. I tried to break free, but it was no use. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside the room. The walls seemed to close in around me, the mirror now the only thing that mattered. The man was there, in the mirror, and he was beckoning to me, his fingers twitching, his smile growing wider with every passing second. I wanted to scream, to run, but the mirror's grip was stronger than I ever could have imagined. The reflection was no longer mine. It was his. And as I felt the coldness of his hand on my shoulder, I understood. I had become part of the mirror, trapped forever in the glass, a face that would never be seen again except through broken eyes. And somewhere, in the depths of that cracked reflection, I could still see him. Waiting. Watching. Smiling. I had always enjoyed the freedom of road trips, driving alone, the endless stretch of road, the hum of the engine, and the solitude that made every mile feel like an escape. This trip was supposed to be the same, a peaceful getaway to a cabin in the woods, far from the noise and stress of everyday life. But as the day turned to night and the road wound deeper into unfamiliar territory, something unusual began to happen. It started small, a distant sound, barely audible over the engine. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees. But then, as the miles stretched on, the sound grew clearer. Screams. Faint at first, barely more than an eerie whisper against the stillness, but unmistakable nonetheless. I tried to ignore them. After all, I was miles from the nearest town. But the more I drove, the more persistent the sound became. I glanced around. The road was deserted, just a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wilderness. There were no signs of life, no other cars, no houses, no lights. It didn't make sense. Yet the screams kept coming, a distant, agonizing cry that seemed to beckon me forward. Against my better judgment, I pressed on. The sound was too haunting to ignore, and something deep within me urged me to find its source. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but I couldn't turn back now. The night was dark, the road unfamiliar, and what I found waiting for me at the end of that road was something I could never have prepared for. As I continued down the winding road, the dense trees on either side seemed to grow thicker, the darkness deeper. The night felt oppressive, like a weight on my chest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn toward whatever was causing those screams. It was as if they had a pull on me, a magnetism I couldn't resist. The road suddenly veered sharply to the right, and through the trees, I glimpsed a faint glow. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't look like any town I'd ever come across. The lights were dim, flickering in a way that made it look almost unnatural. I slowed the car, my headlights illuminating the stretch of road ahead. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No people, no cars, just the endless sound of those terrible screams, growing louder with every passing second. Then, I saw it, a rusted, crooked sign on the side of the road. It read, "Welcome to Hollow Creek." I stopped the car. The name didn't ring any bells, and there was nothing around to suggest this place had been on any map I'd seen. My curiosity got the better of me. The screams seemed to be coming from deeper within the town, a place that, according to the sign, I'd just entered. I knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't turn back. I had to know what was happening here. I shut off the engine, the sudden silence around me almost deafening. The air felt still, unnaturally so. The only sound was that distant scream, now clearer and more defined. It was a high-pitched wail, full of pain and fear, but it was also strange, almost distorted, like it wasn't entirely human. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin. The town loomed ahead, its buildings decaying, abandoned, their windows shattered or boarded up. Yet, somehow, it felt alive, as if the very ground beneath my feet was breathing, watching me. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, fighting a growing unease. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I walked slowly toward the town center. The scream grew louder, now unmistakably close, as if someone, or something, was right behind me. I whirled around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the road was empty. My breath came in shallow bursts. I moved forward again, and that's when I noticed them, figures moving in the shadows. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I stepped closer, I could see them more clearly. People, or what had once been people, shambled through the darkness. Their movements were jerky, unnaturally slow, and their bodies were twisted, as if their limbs were too long for their frames. They were covered in rags, their faces obscured by the shadows, but their eyes, hollow. Empty. They weren't looking at me, but I felt the weight of their gaze nonetheless. And the screams, they were coming from these figures. I staggered back, my legs suddenly weak. The air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The figures stopped in unison, and without warning, they turned toward me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. They stared at me, no, not at me, through me. Their eyes were like black pits, and their mouths opened, emitting an inhuman chorus of sound, all jumbled together, whispers, moans, and screams, like a mass of voices trapped in a single, writhing body. Some of them weren't even fully formed. Parts of their bodies were decayed, raw, exposed to the air. The worst part? I could swear I heard a voice, familiar, my own, screaming in agony. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. I had to get out. I had to leave. But then, as if in answer to my thoughts, the figures began to move toward me. Slow, deliberate steps, the sound of their feet dragging against the dirt like nails on a chalkboard. The air seemed to hum with the energy of something dark, something ancient. The town, Hollow Creek, was alive, and it wanted me. I turned and ran. My breath was ragged, my legs heavy, as if the very ground itself was trying to hold me down. The sound of the figures' footsteps behind me was deafening, their presence closing in with each passing second. I reached my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the door handle. I could hear them now, closer than ever, whispers and screams rising in intensity, as though they were about to overtake me. I finally got the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest, the terror almost too much to bear. I slammed the car into drive and tore down the road, tires screeching against the asphalt. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, a sickening realization struck me. Hollow Creek wasn't just behind me. It was still there. The town. The figures. They were following me, their faces distorted in the darkness, a pale glow flickering in the distance. And though I had left it behind, I could feel it in my bones. Hollow Creek was never going to let me go. The screams followed me all the way home. I drove for hours, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The headlights cut through the darkness, but no matter how fast I drove, it felt like Hollow Creek was always just beyond the next curve, lingering like a shadow at the edge of my vision. The screams, distant yet unbearably close, echoed in my mind, drowning out my thoughts, filling every inch of the car with a sense of impending doom. When I finally pulled off the road, the familiar lights of a gas station blinked in the distance. I hadn't realized how much I'd been holding my breath until I let it go in a shuddering exhale. I stopped the car, the engine cutting off with a loud pop, leaving only the eerie silence of the night. I looked around, making sure the gas station was real, that I wasn't still caught in the grip of some fevered nightmare. Everything seemed normal. The lights, the weathered pumps, the quiet hum of a distant truck engine. But the moment I stepped out of the car, my pulse quickened. The air was still. Too still. The sound, those horrible screams, still lingered, only now they were closer than ever. My heart skipped a beat. They weren't coming from behind me anymore. They were coming from within the town. Hollow Creek wasn't just a place I'd left behind. It was reaching out, still clawing at me, pulling me back. I spun around, panic rising in my chest, only to see nothing. The road behind me was empty, the town hidden by the trees in the distance. The night was so quiet, it was suffocating. I was safe, I told myself. Safe, for now. But then, as I looked down at the ground, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at my feet, was a faded, cracked piece of the very same sign I'd seen back in Hollow Creek, "Welcome to Hollow Creek." I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. The gas station, the trees, the distant road, everything was gone. The town was back. It had never left. In the distance, I heard the screams again. Louder this time. Closer. And as I took a step backward, I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't going to escape. Not this time. Hollow Creek wasn't just a place. It was a nightmare that followed you, hunted you, trapped you forever. And in that moment, I understood the terrible truth. Once you've crossed into Hollow Creek, you never leave. It was supposed to be a peaceful walk, just a short escape from the chaos of my day. A chance to clear my mind, to reset. I needed to breathe, to get away from the weight of everything pressing on me. So, I slipped out into the night, eager to find some quiet. But now, as I stood in the middle of the darkness, disoriented and alone, I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. The world around me was thick with shadows, no stars in the sky, no moon to guide me. The air was cold, biting, as though the night itself was trying to swallow me whole. I looked around, but nothing looked familiar. The path I thought I'd been walking on was gone, swallowed by the endless dark. Panic began to curdle in my chest, but then, I saw them. A faint glimmer in the distance, just pinpricks of light, barely visible through the veil of black. They stood out like stars against the void, but they were too close to the ground, too steady. Maybe they were houses, or a road, or a town, I couldn't tell. But they were there, and for a moment, I convinced myself that they held the answers. Maybe it was civilization, a way out of this forsaken place. I took a step toward them, then another. The ground beneath me felt uneven, strange. My shoes crunched over gravel, sharp twigs, the sound too loud in the silence. Each step seemed to echo, stretching into the nothingness around me. Yet, despite the overwhelming emptiness, those lights, they were so close, and they seemed like the only thing that mattered now. The thought of being lost, of wandering forever in this suffocating darkness, made my skin crawl. The closer I got, the clearer the lights became. They flickered like streetlights, their warm glow promising safety. Maybe there was a road, or people, or warmth waiting for me. I walked faster, pushing myself, my chest tightening with each hurried step. My breath became shallow, my heart thumping wildly in my ribcage. The lights, they were close now, within reach. I could almost feel their warmth, almost hear the hum of life from whatever awaited at their source. But the moment I thought I was almost there, they shifted. The lights, like the cruelest of mirages, began to move, slightly at first, just enough to make me doubt myself. I slowed, squinting. They were further away than before. I quickened my pace, my feet stumbling as I tried to keep up. The lights, why were they moving? Were they playing tricks on me? Or was it my mind betraying me? I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the night, a shifting of perspective. But as I kept walking, the lights retreated again, stretching farther away, almost as though they were mocking me, as though they didn't want me to get any closer. I tried to stop, to think, to reason, but panic rose like bile in my throat. I had to reach them. They had to be real. They had to lead me somewhere. I ran now, my feet pounding the earth beneath me, my breaths coming in frantic gasps. The lights had to be there. They had to be a sign, a way out. But every time I thought I was gaining on them, they slipped further, like something toying with me, teasing me with the promise of safety only to take it away at the last second. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, cutting through my clothes and skin, but still, I couldn't stop. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I pushed forward, desperate, each step growing more frantic than the last. The lights were all I had now. The only thing that made any sense in this suffocating darkness. But still, they pulled away. And then, just as my legs began to feel like lead, as if they might buckle beneath me, the lights did something unexpected. They dimmed, flickering briefly, almost as if in warning. A chill ran down my spine, and a strange feeling twisted in my gut. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. I froze in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. Was that a sound? A movement? Something in the corner of my vision. I couldn't focus on it. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the black void behind me. There was nothing there. But I knew it wasn't nothing. I could feel it. Something was lurking, something watching. I turned back toward the lights, thinking maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe I was losing my mind. But when I looked, the lights, no longer bright, no longer welcoming, were even farther away, now barely visible as small, distant flickers. Panic surged through me again, thick and suffocating. Then I heard it. A sound, low, distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind or the usual sounds of the forest. It was a dragging, a scraping, like something moving in the shadows, just out of view. My pulse hammered in my throat as I glanced over my shoulder again, my breath catching. The shadows were moving. No, they were moving. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel the shape of them. Whatever they were circling. Watching me. And I was alone. Alone in the dark, with only the flickering lights that had lured me in. I started walking again, slowly at first, but then more quickly. The lights, they had to be real. I had to reach them. But as I hurried, I saw them again, those shapes, darting in and out of the darkness behind me, just at the edges of my vision. They weren't far. I could feel them getting closer, and I was running now. My feet were numb, my body trembling with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I had to get to the lights. My legs burned, my vision blurred, but the lights, those lights, they kept slipping farther away, always just beyond my reach. And then, finally, when I was on the brink of collapse, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The lights weren't real at all. They were reflections, mirrors, maybe, or something worse, a trick of the mind that kept me running. But by then, it was too late. The shadows were all around me, and the lights had never been real. I fell to my knees, my chest heaving, as the darkness closed in. And as the world went silent, one final, terrifying thought struck me: the lights weren't just guiding me. They were leading me straight to this moment, to them star. The game wasn't just mine to lose. It was theirs to win. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt as though it were being crushed under the weight of the darkness, and yet the air was still and cold. The lights were gone now, vanished like a cruel illusion, leaving only the oppressive, suffocating blackness. I wanted to scream, but the sound lodged itself in my throat, strangled by the terror that had taken root in my mind. The shapes, were close now, so close that I could feel them shifting in the air around me. No longer distant, no longer just whispers in the corners of my mind. The shadows wrapped around me, clinging to my skin, seeping into my bones. I tried to stand, but my legs refused to obey. I was paralyzed by fear, by the overwhelming sense that I was no longer in control. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head, eyes wide, scanning the darkness, and that's when I saw them, flickering shapes, barely visible at first but growing clearer with each passing second. They were figures, not human, not even recognizable as anything I'd ever seen. They moved like smoke, their outlines shifting and blurring, but I could feel them. The cold, the weight, the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching. They didn't have faces, not in the way that I understood faces. They were more like distorted reflections of what I feared most, and with each flicker, they came closer, closer, until I felt their presence in every fiber of my being. I tried to cry out, tried to move, but my body betrayed me. My limbs were numb, frozen by an invisible force that kept me tethered to the ground, bound to the shadows. The fear, the cold, the absolute wrongness of it all suffocated me. I was caught in a web of illusions, in a place where the rules didn't exist, where the lights were nothing more than a lure, a way to pull me deeper into this nightmare. I could feel their eyes on me, or what could have been eyes, though there was nothing to see. Their presence was like a slow, creeping decay, like something that had been waiting for centuries to claim me, to consume me. The last thing I heard before everything went silent, before the lights, the figures, and the world itself dissolved into nothingness, was the soft, chilling sound of a whisper. It wasn't words, not exactly. But it was unmistakable. Asterisk, welcome home. Asterisk. And then, nothing. The darkness swallowed me whole. It had been a long, grueling day on the farm. The sun had set, casting an eerie orange glow over the fields as I finished the last of my chores. The farm was remote, isolated, just how I liked it, for the most part. Peaceful. But peace, I was learning, was never as simple as it seemed. I'd been working alone all day, the only sound the hum of insects and the rustle of the wind through the crops. The kind of stillness that would normally settle in my bones, making me feel at ease. But tonight, something was different. It started with the feeling that I wasn't alone. You know the one, the sensation that someone is watching you, even if there's no one around. At first, I ignored it. The farm was quiet, as usual, and I chalked it up to the exhaustion setting in. But when I glanced out toward the horizon, I saw him. A man standing just at the edge of the field. He hadn't been there before, and I didn't remember seeing him arrive. Something about him felt off. But I wasn't about to make a fuss over it. After all, I was alone on this farm, and it wasn't unheard of for a neighbor or someone passing through to wander by. Or so I told myself. I turned away, trying to focus on finishing my work. I moved quickly, picking up the tools scattered around the yard, my mind preoccupied with the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't shake it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my muscles stiffening with unease. I glanced over my shoulder again, half expecting to see nothing, but the figure was still there, standing in the same place, unmoving. His clothes were dark, blending with the shadows of the evening, and his wide-brimmed hat cast a deep shadow over his face. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his gaze burning into me, as though his eyes were searching for something. I forced myself to keep working. It's nothing, I told myself. Asterisk, just someone passing through. Nothing to worry about, asterisk, but the longer I stood there, the more it felt wrong. There was no reason for someone to be out here at this hour, not in this desolate stretch of farmland. And yet, when I looked again, he was closer. Not by much, but enough to make my stomach twist. I hadn't seen him move, but somehow, he was standing just inside the line of trees bordering the field. His posture was stiff, unnaturally still, like a statue. And there was something in his stance, something unnerving, like he was waiting for me. My heart began to pound, and I could feel the sweat collecting on my palms. I quickly turned my attention back to my tasks, trying to ignore the mounting sense of dread. The wind had died down, leaving only the quiet rustling of my clothing and the faint chirp of insects. The farm seemed too still, too silent. But then came his voice. "I'm just keeping an eye on things," he called out, his tone low and calm, too calm. It felt wrong, like he was trying to reassure me, but his words only made the pit in my stomach deepen. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to acknowledge him, but it felt as if I had no choice. I turned slowly, forcing myself to face him, but I couldn't see his face. Only the shadowed outline of his body against the dimming light. I waved, though it felt hollow, just to acknowledge him, to make it seem like everything was fine. He waved back, his hand moving slowly, almost deliberately. His eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, never left me. It was as if he could see straight through me, down to my very thoughts. I tried to return to my work, to keep my mind focused on the menial tasks at hand. But the tension in the air was suffocating, like I was being pulled towards something I couldn't understand. I looked again. He was closer now. Barely more than a few yards away, standing at the edge of the barn. My heart raced. How did he get there so fast? I swallowed hard, taking a step back. His eyes still felt like they were on me, even though he hadn't moved a muscle. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. My legs were starting to feel like jelly, but I didn't dare turn away from him. I couldn't. "Is everything okay?" I called out, my voice shakier than I intended. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind picking up again, the soft scrape of his boots against the ground as he took another step closer. I stumbled backward, my heart thudding in my chest, but still, he didn't speak. The silence between us stretched long, suffocating, until it was unbearable. The next time I turned around, I was almost too afraid to look. But I did. And when I did, my blood ran cold. He was standing just a few feet away from me now. So close that I could feel the cold air around him, thick and heavy, like his presence was bleeding into the world around me. His face, now visible, was blank, hollow, a pale, gaunt figure with sunken eyes that seemed to pierce through me. His lips barely moved when he spoke. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice like the creak of an old door, slow and deliberate. "I'm just here to watch." I backed away again, stumbling over the tools I had left on the ground, my chest tight with panic. His gaze never wavered. He was smiling now, but it wasn't a smile. It was something, colder, darker, a stretching of his face that seemed impossible. "Please," I whispered, my throat dry, but my voice barely a sound. "Leave me alone." But he took another step, closing the gap between us, his eyes burning with something I couldn't understand. I felt like I was being pulled into them, like they were reaching inside me, dragging my very soul out of my body. His next words hit me like a punch in the stomach. "You can't escape." I turned and ran. I had to get away, had to make it to the house, to somewhere where I could lock the door and feel safe. But my feet couldn't move fast enough. The sound of his steps, slow but deliberate, followed me, like a predator toying with its prey. The barn was close, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to know how much closer he had gotten. The fear gripping me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. I stumbled through the barn door, slamming it shut behind me, my breath ragged as I backed into the corner. I stayed there for hours, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. I heard nothing from outside. No footsteps, no voice, no sound of any kind. But I could feel him, waiting out there, watching, just beyond the walls. His presence was like a weight in the air, pressing down on me. And though I didn't dare look outside again, I knew, he was still there. Waiting. Watching. I don't know how long I stayed there in that dark corner of the barn, but it felt like an eternity. My eyes never strayed from the small crack in the door, through which the faintest sliver of moonlight filtered in. I thought if I just stayed perfectly still, if I didn't make a sound, maybe, just maybe, he would leave. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew he wasn't going anywhere. As the hours dragged on, the weight of the silence pressed harder. The stillness outside was almost too heavy to bear. No sounds of the wind, no chirping insects, just that suffocating quiet. I tried to convince myself it was just my fear playing tricks on me, but something in my gut told me it was far worse than that. I gathered what little courage I had left and slowly moved toward the barn door, inching closer, trying to breathe as silently as possible. My hand trembled as I reached for the latch, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. What if he was still out there? What if he was just waiting, like he had before? I froze as a sound reached my ears, footsteps, slow and deliberate, from just beyond the door. They were closer now. My heart stopped. He's inside. Panic surged through me like a jolt of electricity. My mind raced, fighting to come up with some plan, but my body was frozen, unwilling to act. The barn was silent again, as if everything had paused, holding its breath with me. The steps stopped, right outside the door. I slowly turned away, not wanting to make a sound. But then, from behind me, came the voice, his voice, so close it was as if he were whispering right into my ear. "You can't hide from me." I spun around, and there he was. Standing in the corner of the barn, just a few feet away, his hollow eyes staring directly into mine. His smile had stretched wider, grotesque, impossibly wide, like his mouth was a cavern, and his teeth were sharp, jagged, glistening in the dim light. His presence filled the room, suffocating, consuming. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was tight, and my legs refused to move. His hand reached out, not with urgency, but with an eerie calm, like he had all the time in the world. The air grew colder, and a deep, primal fear flooded through me. "Why?" I whispered, though I didn't know if I was asking him or myself. His lips twitched into a smile again, and he leaned in, his breath cold against my cheek. "Because I'm the night watchman. I always watch." And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Vanished, like smoke into the night, leaving only the lingering cold and the silence that followed. I didn't wait another second. I bolted out of the barn, not caring where I was going, only that I had to get away. I ran through the dark fields, my breath ragged and sharp, as I fought to keep my mind from spiraling. I ran until the exhaustion nearly overtook me, until I collapsed on the porch of the farmhouse, my body trembling violently. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the next. The fear didn't leave me, it followed me, lurking in the shadows. And though I never saw him again, I knew he was still there, watching. Every night, from the corner of my eye, I could see his silhouette standing at the edge of the field, unmoving, waiting. The night watchman was always watching,